community, and even a denominational community. This was a Presbyterian church, Christian school. And think about that suffering on the part of those individuals. And just imagine, you send your child off to school in the morning, you drop them off at school, and you go home, and halfway through the day, you get a call. Can you imagine? And who can make sense of any of that? Right? In his book, Radically Whole, David Gibson, it's a sort of a commentary on the book of James, but he comments on such evil and the suffering it brings, and he says this. He says, asking where God is in the midst of such sorrow is a fair question. It's not the inquiry. Now, it's not the inquiry like from the ivory tower. It's not the inquiry of someone with his or her head in the clouds. Rather, such questioning emerges from the reality of life's deep valleys and from the hard reality of bitter tears that won't stop flowing. Yeah, that's exactly the kind of question that James is going to attempt to answer here in this passage. But in his answer, he, again, is not approaching this from an ivory tower, seminary classroom, or something like that. Instead, he approaches it very pastorally, as if he's got his arm around the suffering child of God and offers some counsel, offers some advice to help them bear the burden of their pain. Really, the rest of chapter 5, from verse 7 through the end of the book, end of the chapter, deals with the problem of suffering Christians. But the passage can be divided in two sections, and this morning we're going to look at one of those sections, and next week at the balance of the chapter, and therefore the balance of the book. Verses 7 to 12, what we'll look at today, speaks of suffering as it tells us something, suffering, telling us something about our posture before the Lord. The suffering and our response to it can grow us in steadfastness. Next week, in verses 13 to 20, James deals with suffering in a little different way. And in that section, suffering can tell us something about our relationship with the Lord. So today's section, it tells us about our posture before the Lord and can grow us in steadfastness. Next week, the passage talks about our relationship with the Lord, and suffering in that context can expose our sinfulness and rebellion. And Gibson points out in both of these sections that James has his eye on different ways of suffering that can be the Lord's healing medicine for the malady of our divided hearts. Let me say that again. In both sections, James has his eye on the different ways suffering can be the Lord's healing medicine. Suffering as healing medicine for the malady of our divided hearts. In other words, this medicine of suffering can bring wholeness to the division of our hearts. So today we want to consider verses 7 to 12. Let's read the passage and then discuss it. So he begins in verse 7. Therefore, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. But above all, my brethren, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no, no, lest you fall into judgment. Well, in this section, what I want us to see this morning is that wholeness, remember, suffering as medicine that can bring wholeness to our divided heart. That wholeness can be found as you and I, in suffering, take a rather surprising stance. A surprising stance. Now, the suffering is real. He begins this verse 7, with the word therefore. And you know, this has been pointed out thousands of times before, you know that that's a pointer to direct you back to what has already been discussed. And what has been discussed? In the previous section, he's talking about the oppression of the unconverted rich. In fact, verses 4 and following, he talks about the wages of the laborer who mowed the fields. The rich are keeping back by fraud, and they cry out. And the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. And they condemn, verse 6, and have murdered the just, and the just can't resist them. So the suffering that's very real, which the therefore is tying into, can be direct. In other words, the people that James is writing to, many of them may themselves be very much the victims of the oppression of the rich, of the wicked rich. Now this is not something that we see quite so vividly as could be seen in the first century. In other words, the kind of oppression that comes from the wicked rich today might be the kind of oppression where wages are suppressed simply because the owner of a business or whatever wants to get rich off of the laborers of the people. He's not concerned about them. He's not concerned about their welfare. All he's concerned about is his own portfolio or his own, padding his own thing. But in the first century, the ability of the wicked rich to oppress the poor was far more severe and consequential. So it can be direct like that, but it, I think, can also be the oppression from the rich, can be indirect. And what I mean by that takes us back to Psalm 73. If you were here last Sunday, we looked at that psalm, and in that psalm, you see the suffering of the writer of the psalm, Asaph, as he expresses more of a mental or spiritual or emotional suffering. Let me show you what I mean if you want to flip back there to Psalm 73. He says in verses 1 and 2, especially verse 2, he says, "As for me, my feet had almost stumbled, my steps had nearly slipped." He had almost stumbled into envy. He says, "For I was envious of the boastful," in verse 3. In verses 4 and 5, and then down in verses 11 and 12, he wrestles with the incongruity of all of this. He says these rich people, they don't have any pangs in their death. They don't seem to be suffering. It's like their money can buy them out of suffering. And yet what do I have to go through? Look what I have to go through. My money, I don't have the money to buy myself out of such suffering. In verses 13 and 14, that then compels him to struggle with the apparent futility of being righteous. He says, "Surely I've cleansed my heart in vain and washed my hands in innocence. For all day long I've been plagued and chastised and chastened every morning. And what good has it been? What good is it? Where has it gotten me?" Have you ever felt that way? You ever thought that? Maybe you wouldn't admit it to anybody else, but maybe you've thought that way in your own heart. I've done this, I've tried to do right, and and this is what I get for it. This is what I get for it. Well, this is his position. He's struggling with the apparent futility of living a righteous life. And then in verse 16, he ends up suffering under this internal conflict. He says, "When I thought about how to understand this, it was too painful for me." It was too painful for me. So the suffering is real. It can be direct or it can be indirect, but either way, it's very real suffering. Now, back in James chapter 5, you notice that the response that's called for to such suffering is quite challenging. James says, therefore, be patient. Be patient. One of the hardest things in the world is to be told to be patient. Right? Isn't it? How many of you like to go to the driver's license facility? You chuckle. Why do you chuckle? Because you know when you go to the driver's license facility, you better be prayed up and be ready with a good dose of patience, because you're going to sit and you're going to wait. Now, I want you to realize there are a couple of different kinds of waiting. There's one kind of waiting that doesn't shape your life at all. How many of you have used Amazon? Okay, so what happens? You go on Amazon.com, you're looking for the product you want, you find it, you put it in the shopping cart, you check out, and boom. And if you have Amazon Prime, then you're going to get that product in 2 to 3 days. If you don't and you get the free shipping, because it's over so much, it may take 4 or 5 days. But here's the thing. There's not a thing in the world you can do about getting that product to your home any faster than the method of shipping that you've ordered. There's nothing you can do. Until it arrives, what do? You simply wait for it. It doesn't shape your life at all as you wait for that package to arrive. Or, for example, another example of this. Today is Clayton's birthday, and Thursday night we had a little birthday party for him at our house. Thursday late afternoon, had a little party for him, and we had the supper he wanted, but he really didn't want to eat too much supper. And of course, then my wife made this ice cream cake, because he loves ice cream. He doesn't care much for cake. He just likes ice cream. So she made this ice cream cake and decorated up with trains on the top and all this stuff. And she cut him a slice of the ice cream cake, put it in front of him, and he started to eat it, and he ate a little bit of it, but he really didn't want to eat the cake. Why? What? Gifts. Yeah. He had to wait for the presents. Now, there was not a thing in the world he could do to make those presents arrive any faster. Now, they were going to come when they were going to come. All right, that's one kind of waiting. It doesn't really shape your life. But another kind of waiting is a kind that compels you to live differently. So, for example, Chris has a laptop that she uses primarily for her RB network. And she got one a few years ago, and that thing started acting up really crazy. You try to use the mouse pad, and the cursor's just going everywhere. And even sticking a mouse, plugging in a mouse, try to use it. Sometimes that would go crazy. It was just, so finally RBNet said, get a new one. Your work is too important to be horsing around with that. So she got a new computer, a really good one. And a couple of weeks ago, she opened up this computer. It's one of these where you can take the lid, the screen, and fold it all the way back. It's that kind of hinge on it. So she opened up her computer one day, and the right hinge had just broken, and the display, the thing was starting to come apart at the seam. Well, it's still under warranty, so she calls HP to get the warranty information. They say, yeah, okay, it's under warranty. We're going to send you a box, put the computer in a box, and send it back. And in 3 to 5 business days, it'll be returned to you after we get it. It'll be repaired and returned to you. Okay, so a couple days later, the box shows up. She packs the thing up, sends it back to HP. This whole process was probably about a 10-day turnaround time. And again, there wasn't anything she could do about changing the timing so that it was shorter, but waiting required a significant change of her life. And waiting for that thing to get repaired, and preparing for that, just to prepare to send the thing off, She had to get an external hard drive, plug it into the new computer, copy all of her files onto the external drive, plug that back into the old computer where the cursor goes crazy, and copy those files back to the old computer. Then she had to pack up that thing, ship it off, and so they could fix the thing. And then she had to be working off of that old computer, which had a very unreliable cursor. And it, tempted her to do a little bit of cursing, but cursing the cursor. I speak as a fool. But the point is that waiting affected what she did day after day. The same thing can happen like if your furnace goes out. Well, maybe today your air conditioner goes out. But think about this in January. It's 10 below outside. You get up in the morning, it's cold in your house. You wonder, what in the world's going on? You realize your furnace is out, and you don't know why. You don't understand why. You check the pilot light. It's not the pilot. It's just dead. So you call the furnace repair people, and they say, oh, man, we're swamped. We can't get out for 2 days. For 2 days. You have to wait for your furnace to get fixed. Question, is that going to alter your life in any way? Yeah, absolutely it is. All right, it's that kind of waiting that James has in mind here when he says that we need to be patient. A kind of patience, a kind of waiting that is going to alter our lives. Gibson put it this way: it's a form of living today that is profoundly affected by what we know is coming tomorrow or down the road. All right? So the perspective that is essential for us to be able to respond to suffering in this way. He says, therefore, be patient. Okay, how can I be patient? What is the perspective I need in order to be able to wait well? How should my life be altered? What perspective do I need to have so that my life is altered in a way that I wait well, that I am patient? Verse 7 goes on to say, until the coming of the Lord. Until the coming of the Lord. So again, Gibson, he says, the greatest problem we have in our suffering is a poor grasp of who it is we are waiting for and where he is while we're waiting. Okay, who are we waiting for? Who are we waiting for? James identifies him with in two ways. Here in the beginning of verse 7, he calls him the Lord. Actually, he refers to him as the Lord 5 times in this passage, verses 7 to 12. Here in verse 7, again in verse 8, he says, the coming of the Lord is at hand. In verse 10, he says, the prophet spoke in the name of the Lord. And in verse 11, you've seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. So we're waiting for the Lord. Who is the Lord? The term itself indicates that of sovereign oversight, of sovereign authority. We're waiting for the Lord who is in charge of absolutely everything on the earth. Remember in our study in Colossians chapter 1, Paul writes that the Lord Jesus is the creator of all things. He is the creator of all things and the sustainer of all things. That in all things he might have the preeminence. Who is that? The Lord. He is the one who is over absolutely everything. He is in charge of absolutely everything on the earth. That's who we're waiting for. We're waiting for the one who is in charge of absolutely everything in all of the earth. Now stop and think about that for a minute. Going through a time of suffering, be patient until the coming of the Lord. Even in that statement, I have to stop and acknowledge that my God is the one who is absolutely in charge of absolutely everything in all the earth. That puts a perspective on my suffering. I'm not saying it makes it easy. I'm saying it gives us a perspective. But we're waiting for the Lord. And secondly, in verse 9, the last part of verse 9, he refers to him as the judge. He says, "Behold, the judge is standing at the door." All right, so look, get this. Get the significance of these two titles of Jesus Christ. The Lord who is the judge. We're waiting not only for the one who is in charge of everything as the Lord, but as the judge, we're waiting for the one who can fix everything. All right? As the judge, he's the one who will fix everything. And this, Gibson points out, this is the glorious gospel. Here's the big picture. Genesis to Revelation. God made it. We broke it. Christ fixes it. The judge fixes it. That's the gospel. God made it. We broke it. Jesus fixes it. And that fixing comes in two stages. One stage is already done. Stage one is when Jesus came to deal with sin and to pay the penalty of sin. Stage two is when Jesus will come to deal with sin's presence and its pain. In the meantime, we're in this parenthesis of brokenness. There's so much brokenness, which means, therefore, there's so much suffering. Again, let me read you this quote from Gibson. He says, "There's brokenness at every turn. In our homes, in our wombs, in our cities, in our nation, in our world, in our children, in our parents, in our politicians, among the rich who crush the poor, among the strong who destroy the weak, in our minds with Alzheimer's that is robbing us of our loved ones right in front of our eyes, and in the depression that just won't lift. You will have your own personal and painful experience of life gone wrong on this side of Eden. We live with all of this because while Jesus has already come as Lord, we still await the day of his coming as judge. We're waiting for the judge. So who is it? Who is it that we are waiting for? The Lord, who is the judge. Well, then the next point in that quote earlier that I gave is that our problem that we have in suffering is a poor grasp of who it is that we're waiting for and where he is while we're waiting for him. Where is he? Where is he? Look at verse 9 again. The judge, where is he? Standing at the door. Standing at the door. What does that mean? One commentator puts it this way. He says, the hand is about to turn, and the door of world history is about to swing on its hinges, and we will meet the judge of all the earth. So, one of the truths about the second coming of Jesus, about the coming of the judge, is that his coming is imminent. He can come at any time. He's standing at the door. Now, here's the thing about all of this. We can't work out what God is teaching us in our suffering by looking at what is happening to us. We can't process it. We can't work it out. Instead, we work out what we're meant to learn by listening to what God tells us. For the suffering of Christ's people is always to remind us that Christ the King is coming again. So one of the things that needs to that needs to flash in front of our face in the midst of our suffering is Jesus is coming again to fix all this. Jesus is coming again to fix all this. In other words, to get our eyes off of what is happening to us right now and look to our Lord, who is the judge, who will fix it all. Now, James then gives us 3 illustrations that can prove beneficial in order to be able to be patient until the coming of the Lord. 3 illustrations. And in these illustrations, he offers a spectrum of areas where we need patience. So in verse 7, he gives the illustration of the farmer. In verse 10, the prophets. And in verse 11, Job. So each of these illustrations has its own little niche, if you will, of emphasis related to needed patience. Take the farmer, he says in verse 7, who waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and the latter rain. All right? The farmer. What kind of patience is involved in the farmer's life? He needs to be patient through his painful toil, waiting for the fruitful harvest. And there's a long period of waiting in that. There's a lot of patience that can be required. Now, this is an illustration, right? He says, look at the farmer, and we can do that pretty easily in our community. Look at the farmer and how he works hard, he labors hard, but he has to have patience to wait for the harvest. That's the illustration. Here's the application. You and I need to be like farmers, patient in our painful toil. And that painful toil can be in our laboring, our toiling, for example, as a parent. As a parent. And let me tell you something. Some of you moms and dads know this. It doesn't end. It doesn't end. You know, you get that little baby, and they get you up in the middle of the night, and you think, oh man, well, they sleep through the night, then the pain, the suffering of sleeplessness will be over. And they finally sleep through the night, and then you find out they mess up your schedule through the course of the day. And then you say, well, boy, when they finally settle down and get into a pattern and all this kind of stuff, and they get to school and they have a school schedule, then the pain or the suffering of this stage of parenthood will be over, and it will, and then comes another stage. And it just continues. And you say, man, when they get through this teen years and they finally graduate from high school, and you're going to find out, if you haven't already, that the toil of parenting doesn't end. It just changes the way it looks and the way it functions. Well, your pain and toil can be in simply your everyday work, the patience you need in your everyday work, where you get up, you go to work, you do your thing, and you don't necessarily see the point of it all. You don't see the fruit of what you're doing right now. And maybe you've been at it a long time and you haven't really seen, other than a paycheck and putting food on the table, and that, the basic kind of stuff. But it's like, you don't, have you ever said to yourself, I've given my life to this, what for? I mean, what is this for? Be patient, like the farmer. It can be your toil that requires patience, but it can also be God's toil, God's laboring that requires patience. In other words, have you ever asked yourself, especially in the last couple of years, the question that goes something like this: what in the world is God up to in national and international affairs? What is he doing? What is God doing? What is he doing in allowing such violence and hostility? Again, Gibson says this. He says, part of the Christian worldview is that the Bible teaches us to, when you watch the news, and like just was it yesterday, some Looney Tune goes into a mall and kills 9 people. Why? What's God doing in allowing such stuff to go on? I don't know. I don't see the point. I don't have to see the point. It has to be enough to know that there must be one. So, consequently, I'm waiting patiently, like the farmer. But then he brings up the prophets in verse 10. He says, "My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience." Well, here's a different kind of patience required on the part of the prophets. The prophets represent painful mistreatment from others and the patience that's needed for it. Patience through painful mistreatment from others. Hey, question. Who is it that gave the prophets such painful treatment? Think about it. Religious leaders? Yep. Who else? Okay, let's ask this question. Of what nationality was Elijah? Israel, right? What country is he from? Israel. How about Obadiah? Israel. Jonah? Jonah's a little different situation. Habakkuk? Zephaniah? Amos? Moses? Okay, the point is, all of those prophets were from the nation of Israel. Who gave the prophets such painful treatment? Their own people. Yes, that's the point. Their own people. So the prophets suffered most, not exclusively, but most, from their own people. And one of the greatest tests of faith in God can be the behavior that you receive from other believers. Look at James. Go back to chapter 2. In verses 2 and 3, James says, if someone comes into your assembly, a man comes into your assembly with gold rings and fine apparel, and then there comes in one who's poor, a poor man in filthy clothes, and now watch the scenario. Get the scenario. You pay attention to the one wearing the fine clothes, and you say to him, you sit here in a good place, and you say to the poor man, you stand there, or you sit here at my footstool. All right? Question. How would you feel if you were the poor man in this assembly of believers? How would you feel? Would you not feel slighted? Would you not feel shamed and treated poorly by believers? Or chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. He says, with the mouth, with our tongue, we bless God and our God and Father, and with it we curse men who've been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not so to be. And he's not talking about you, brethren, cursing unbelievers out there. He's talking about your behavior toward other believers. So look verse 14. If you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. Bitter envy against whom? Self-seeking related to whom? And then chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and do not have. You murder and covet, can't obtain. You fight and war. You don't have because you do not ask. Is that exclusively the behavior of unbelievers toward other unbelievers? No. Some of you have been around long enough and you've been in churches long enough to know that you can experience that kind of pain from within the church family. And it hurts. And sometimes it's that pain, that suffering, that can be the greatest test of our faith in God. I think it was Gibson who said this. He said, sometimes God's people bear more wounds from other sheep inside the church than from wolves outside the church. And then the third example in verse 11 is Job. Job. Wow, what an umbrella of suffering Job sat under, right? Job illustrates the need of patience when suffering through loss, through physical affliction, through strained relationships. Think even of his own wife who told him to curse God and die. Through misunderstanding, through false accusation. Job is an example of patience. You've heard the perseverance of Job. And such perseverance under that umbrella can be incredibly difficult. And yet, the Lord had an intended end. And what was that intended end? To demonstrate in the end that He is a compassionate and merciful God. All right, so He calls upon us to be patient. How? The method of that patient waiting is critical. Let me suggest a few things. In verse 8, he says, establish your heart. Establish your heart. Set your heart. Fix your heart. Remember your heart. What is your heart? It's the way you think, it's what you desire, and it's what you choose, all wrapped up into one. Fix your heart. Now, the next statement answers either the question why or how. Look at the verse. Verse 8 again. Establish your hearts for, or because, the coming of the Lord is at hand. All right, so is James saying, how can you fix your heart? You can fix your heart knowing that the coming of the Lord is at hand. Or is he giving you a reason for fixing your heart? Because the coming of the Lord is at hand. Either way, the emphasis, the point still remains. Patience is possible as you fix your heart firmly in the truth that Jesus is coming to fix everything that is a mess. He's coming to do that. Establish your heart in that truth. Secondly, method for patiently waiting, in verse 9, is to guard your relationships with other people. Guard your relationships with other people. Do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. So guard your attitude. Don't grumble. That could be translated, don't groan. To complain in an intensive, excessive manner. Don't grumble. Then he says to watch your actions. Don't grumble against one another, brethren. So you take that grumbling and then you can lash out at other people. Don't grumble against one another. You can take out your impatience on others. And isn't it true? And we all know this. We all know this. That sometimes those who are closest to us, those that we love the most, often suffer the most under our impatience. Aren't they the ones that get the brunt of our stuff sometimes? Guard your relationships with others. And then thirdly, in verse 12, and this is maybe a little tricky to understand, but guard your relationship with the Lord. Guard your relationship with the Lord. He says, above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or by earth with any other oath. Let your yes be yes, your no, no. Here's the temptation in suffering. The temptation in suffering is that we can verbalize, we can make promises that we either cannot or will not keep, and even know it. So, for example, oh, God, if you just relieve me of this suffering, I'll never miss a church service again unless I'm just sick. I'll be in Sunday school, I'll be in the morning service, I'll be in the evening service, I'll be at Wednesday night, just get me out of this miserable suffering thing. Or, if you just take this pain away, you get this burden off my shoulders, God, I promise you, I'll double my giving, I'll double my offering. But it's just an oath under duress that you know, if you're honest with yourself, it ain't going to happen. It isn't going to happen. You haven't been to every service in your life. Why would you start now just because it's not so painful anymore? You didn't do it before when it wasn't painful. And double your giving? Well, how are you going to put food on your table? You know you're not going to do that. But that is a temptation, isn't it? I'll do this if you do this. The requirement that is given here in the middle of the verse, let your yes be yes, your no, no, is to be a person of verbal integrity. Don't allow a painful situation to squeeze you into the position of being a hypocrite with your mouth, two-tongued, a split tongue, forked tongue, Don't, and that's the warning. The end of the verse says, lest you fall into judgment. I don't know about you, I have a little marginal note in my Bible next to the word judgment that says that could be hypocrisy. Maybe hypocrisy, lest you fall into hypocrisy. And that's the end of it, right? If you make some kind of a vow like this to get out of your pain, a vow that you're not going to keep, and you know you're not going to keep, then what have you proved yourself to be? Hypocritical, right? Hypocritical. Saying one thing, doing another, living a different way. So in conclusion, Gibson says this: one of the ways God heals our divided hearts is by establishing them with the judgment to come. In other words, there is a kind of wholeness available to us that comes from deep, mature, humble, and profound acceptance of the fact that perfect wholeness will be possible only in the next life, on the other side of Jesus coming again as judge. This is the kind of wholeness that comes from learning to believe that vengeance belongs to the God who will only ever do what is right. And with that kind of understanding, by God's grace, we can therefore be patient until the coming of the Lord. So, Father, help us. Help us to learn this, we pray. We all need it. Teach us in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, got about